Welcome to Renegade Inc, the show that allows us to think differently. One of the biggest Western foreign policy adventures in recent years is something that is underreported in the media. So-called intervention in Libya has created a failed state that is riven with extremists, all vying for power. So we ask, was this really an epic foreign policy mistake, or was destroying Libya just another day at the office for politicians, short-sighted bureaucrats and vulture corporates who continually try to enforce global economic supremacy? Libya was apparently Barack Obama's biggest regret. This is what his then Secretary of State said about the then Libyan leader, Muammar Gaddafi.
So, that is the land of unconfirmed reports.
Yes, we came, we saw, he died.
Did it have anything to do with your visit?
No, I'm sure it did.
We were in Libya as the country fell and shot these images. We listened to the Libyan people who celebrated and believed the noble intentions of the West. The war was sold as Allied forces intervening to deliver a virtuous and prosperous country, but in reality, they were there only for Libya's resources. Joining me to discuss what has gone so badly wrong in Libya are Dr. Matthew Alford, a teaching fellow in politics at University of Bath, and Dr. Tim Coles, the director and founder of Plymouth Institute for Peace Research. Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming by. Tim, I'd ask you, because it is your specialist subject, if you like, just put in context what's happened in Libya and where we're at the moment, because people see the images across social media, they understand that the intervention there hasn't gone to plan, they understand Benghazi is a mess, etc. From your point of view, where are we and what's gone wrong?
Well, Libya is a complete humanitarian disaster. Mass deaths, the country is fragmented along political lines. There's a kind of counterinsurgency war going on. For ordinary Libyans, this has been a complete catastrophe. A lot of it to do with the NATO bombing back in 2011, but also what's happened since then with jihadis flooding the country. And the way that this is portrayed in Western media tends to be as some kind of series of events that are just on the periphery of interest. And what's particularly interesting about the way Western media handle this is we have good evidence from, for example, the British government had an investigation into Libya, into the British role, and their conclusion was that the war was waged on basically a lie. It was sold as a humanitarian intervention because Libya's leader, Muammar Gaddafi, was supposedly about to commit an ethnic cleansing in a region called Benghazi. The British government later admitted that was based on what they called erroneous intelligence, or we could just call it a lie. No evidence was presented at the time. And they also say in the report that it's created a kind of political vacuum to be filled by jihadi groups, including ISIS. The media don't tend to show you the cause and effect. Why do we have massive flows of refugees? And this is quite typical. If you look at the history of the Middle East and North Africa, there's a tactic to smash things up using military force and then to sit back and comment on the mess.
Very cynical.
It's extremely dangerous. In fact, the United States is committed to a policy called full-spectrum dominance. Full-spectrum dominance, as far as the US military understands it, is the ability to dominate the world by force, by simply overwhelming any potential to US challenge. And this can involve space-based weapons, intercontinental ballistic missiles, essentially to encircle the Earth. And the goal, they state this quite openly in their vision for 2020, which was published more than 20 years ago. It stated that the goal is to enforce a global neoliberal economic policy of globalization, as they call it, which means globalization in the interests of US corporations. And of course, this rhetoric continues today in, for example, Trump's national security policy, same full spectrum dominance rhetoric. So when you brazenly announce your intention to rule the world by force, people are going to react. And then you have all sorts of complicated effects, like potential arms race. Terrorist groups would try and defend their own interests in the only way that they know how, which is through terrorism. And the backbone of the global economy, and thus US control over it, is to control countries, politically control countries that have a lot of oil reserves. And the main oil reserves that we know of are in the Middle East. Libya in North Africa has the largest reserves in Africa. And so that's the context in which this has happened. The theme is to try and control the politics of energy-producing regions so that the public can't really socialize that energy. And
what does that mean?
They can't elect a government that will use the reserves and the revenues from that oil in the public interest, because that will close the market to the United States and Britain, France, Italy, the bigger powers. And what happened in Libya is that the United Kingdom for a long time had connections with radical Islamists, with jihadis. So back in the mid-1990s, it was revealed by a whistleblower, David Shaler, that the MI6 had actually wired money to the anti-Gaddafi elements to try and depose him in a coup. The jihadis involved in that, they have a history also connected with the UK. What we now call Al-Qaeda was created in the late 1970s. President Jimmy Carter's National Security Advisor, Brzezinski, he said that our aim was to draw the Soviets into the Afghan trap. So the aim was to train, turned out, about 20,000 jihadis from all over the world. This would provoke the Soviets into invading Afghanistan and draw the Soviets into a long proxy war. Well, these jihadis didn't disappear. They went back to their own countries. Many were granted asylum in the UK. And the late Foreign Secretary of the UK, Robin Cook, he wrote an article saying that what we call Al-Qaeda simply means the database of fighters that Britain was training and arming back in the late 70s and 80s. So, and the same pattern is repeated here. We have leftover elements and, of course, young jihadis. So take, say, Abedi, the man who supposedly blew up the Manchester arena. His father, Ramadan, was actually connected to the group that I mentioned in Libya in the 90s that MI6 was funding. So that's what the Secret Service called blowback, where you create a radical network of some kind, in this case jihadis, and then they go and attack your interests at home. Then we hear now Trump and his advisors talking about the Libya option for North Korea. Yeah. Essentially, Gaddafi, after the invasion of Iraq in 2003, felt sufficiently threatened to give up his deterrence, which was chemical and biological weapons.
So you mentioned earlier the neoliberal doctrine. The Washington Consensus, it's also called in a different way. And this is, as you said, to control the global oil supply for the interests of American corporates and American people, the West more broadly. Did Gaddafi know this was coming?
Yeah, Gaddafi was essentially threatened into making reforms, which means privatizing resources and opening Libya's markets. So the situation that Gaddafi found himself in was trying to stick to his own, in my view, warped and dictatorial policies. You could hardly call it socialist, but by the standards of the region, it had socialist aspects, yet also trying to appease the United States so that they didn't destroy the country and overthrow him. At that point, the British, France as well, certainly the US, started to organize what became the fourth largest jihadi mobilization in history, according to US sources, US military sources, again, hardly reported anywhere. This coincided with the Arab Spring, which was ordinary people's efforts to promote some kind of democratic changes in their own countries. On the surface, the US and Britain were still supporting Gaddafi, but underneath, it later transpired that even before the Arab Spring, the British started to train anti-Gaddafi terrorists, or rebels as they called them.
Moderate rebels.
Yeah, and that's just part of the standard propaganda, that when it's our terrorists, they're not terrorists, they're rebels or freedom fighters. Terrorism only applies to enemies. So this group essentially hijacked the Libyan Arab Spring. And from there, the so-called rebels were using NATO as a kind of air force to destroy Libya. And as I mentioned earlier, complete humanitarian catastrophe for ordinary Libyans. Major war crimes that NATO committed. Ironically, the invasion was, as I said, launched under a humanitarian pretext to stop an ethnic cleansing. A real ethnic cleansing occurred because of the NATO bombing. The jihadis that we were working with started to ethnically cleanse Libya of black Libyans. And you could find some reporting of this, like Amnesty International, but hardly anything. NATO helicopters were watching people drown in the Mediterranean Sea trying to flee to Italy. So suddenly humanitarian intervention goes out the window.
Seems to be a blueprint here. We've seen this before, have we not? We've seen this before, obviously, in Iraq. We've seen it across Middle Eastern countries. And the deep-set cynicism that this policy comes with, this blowback that you talk about, all these terrorist acts, of course they're going to happen across the West, because ultimately we've been on the wrong side of the argument for the best part of about 4 decades, isn't it? I mean, do you see this?
Well, I think it's longer than that. I mean, any great power is going to behave in these kind of ways unless it is called to account by its people. So that's been going on for centuries or even thousands of years.
Right.
So I don't think that it's a problem that's peculiar to the post-1970s or even the post-war world. But I think we can improve society. All societies can improve and have improved with human rights if we challenge the metastasized elements of power at the very top.
Explain metastasized.
My view is that, you know, you've kind of got to have police forces, some form of authority and all those kind of things within a society. But the danger that we have when you leave in power for long periods of time without any accountability, organizations like MI5 and the CIA, NSA and all this, then you end up having such cloistered elements that are always ever protected that you end up having very dangerous entities there. And they know that they can act with impunity. And no recourse to justice. Exactly. So, I mean, the accountability for the CIA, there were big hearings in the mid-1970s in the wake of information coming out showing that they'd been involved in assassinations, for example, against Fidel Castro and broader problems. So that led to some form of accountability for the Central Intelligence Agency and some pullback on what it was willing to do within the world. And so the 1970s in some ways was a bit better. But of course, what that entity learned from that as well was, well, if we want to carry on doing what we were doing before, we better get some better PR. And that's kind of where they went. But it still helped to some extent. Do these powerful state actors now act with impunity?
Yeah. An example of that is the government's own inquiry into the destruction of Libya. They specifically mention that the Prime Minister at the time, Cameron, was culpable for, they're not, honest enough to say war crimes, but that's the implication. And yet Cameron's able to walk around quite freely.
Welcome back to Renegade Inc, the show that allows us to think differently. Before we talk more about Libya and Western intervention with Dr. Tim Coles and Dr. Matthew Alford, let's have a look at what you've been tweeting about in this week's Renegade Inc Index. First up, we've got a tweet from Nayab Chaudhry. Libya, another failed state as a result of a futile intervention in 2011. Civil war, humanitarian and security concerns overwhelm country's current political landscape. Dozens of militia groups, along with ISIL, fighting for power. What's better in Libya today?
Tough to ask Libyans, but the majority seem to think not much.
Next, we have a tweet from Sarah Abdallah replying to AFP's headline. break down on the chaos in Libya since the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi. In a nutshell, Obama, Hillary and their NATO buddies bombed Libya to ruins and paved the way for slave-selling jihadists to take over, transforming a once stable and prosperous country into a completely war-torn, failed state.
And don't forget the casualty figures. By the Libyan government's own estimate, 30,000 people died in that first year.
And these people are of very little interest to Western media.
Which is why we don't know it.
Except when they cause a problem to us.
Next from Musa, why is everyone calling West's declaration of war against nations intervention when a foreign military enter and occupy another country's land against its government? It's called invasion and occupation. US is occupying Syria, Iraq, Libya, etc. Finally, from Middle East Eye, after a century of exploitation, intervention and betrayal by the West, it should come as no surprise that anti-Western extremist movements have surfaced throughout the Arab world. In the first half, we talked, and Tim mentioned this full spectrum dominance. The argument for is we're the good guys, i.e. America and Western powers are the good guys. We're spreading democracy, we're spreading the rule of law, we're spreading freedom, often at the end of the barrel of a gun, but we're doing it. And the argument for it is saying, if we don't do it, somebody else is going to do it. You hear it all the time. Is that an argument?
I think we should be aware of how powerful the West is. All right, yeah, countries like China or whatever, they could impose human rights abuses further afield if there is a power vacuum left. But at the moment, we dwarf these other nations in terms of human rights abuses, the number of people we kill. It's a matter of overkill, I think. If you're a comedian in a club or a teacher in a school, it's all very well to impose some form of order, but if you start using violence to great extent and the threats go way out of control, then that's what we are. That's what our civilization is doing in all sorts of these different parts of the world. Yes, order and yes, some kind of military is necessary on our side of the world for genuine humanitarian intervention is important, and to maintain the integrity of our own nations. But we are so far beyond that. Do you agree?
I can't think of a single genuine humanitarian intervention. It's always done under the propagandistic cover of being in the interests of humanity. And the so-called Third World rejects the doctrine of humanitarian intervention because they've been on the receiving end of it for centuries. British Empire, French Empire, American Empire, so they know exactly what it is. It's just thinly masked colonialism. And we should also ask, who actually has the capability to dominate the world? It's certainly not China, and we know that because US military reports to Congress say so. They say that China's reach is regional. We know that Russia has no intention to dominate the world. We know that from US Army reports. They said with the case of Ukraine, they said if NATO starts to interfere in Ukraine, that will provoke Russia. They didn't talk about Russia starting an aggression. So the military themselves understand this state of global affairs perfectly well, but try getting the media to recognize that.
When we talk about the military-industrial complex, should we talk about the media and military-industrial complex as one unit? Because it seems to me that there isn't this talk, there isn't this debate, there's a lot of what's left unsaid, there's a certain sort of selective amnesia about what's reported. Should it actually be called the media and military-industrial complex?
It depends on the specific media. So with the BBC, for example, it's basically the state, and the state is involved in all of the things that we've been talking about. So the lines get extremely blurred there.
I co-authored a book called National Security Cinema, which points you to my position, which is that there are strong elements of the national security state, the military-industrial complex, the CIA, the Department of Defense, involved in the creation of film scripts that are anything to do with American foreign policy or anything to do with these institutions that dominate American foreign policy.
So we should call it the media and military-industrial complex.
So you could perhaps call it the media. I mean...
Or is that conspiracy theory?
I wouldn't say it's a conspiracy theory. I'd just say it's possibly perhaps over-egging it a little bit because there is still independence within the media organisations to a reasonable extent. I think it's important to remember, we can use independent media to push out important messages as well.
The sense I get from the book is that it is not just one act of propaganda. The propaganda war is incessant and it's very subtle.
I think that all organizations, military industrial organizations, are involved in the creation of script, whether that's news or entertainment. They do it on a constant basis. There are large PR organizations that are set up to do that, and it's a constant process. It's not particularly well known, and part of the reason for that is that until myself and Tom Secker did this research, it was commonly accepted that there were only a few hundred films that had ever been through even the Department of Defense, for example.
Is that right?
No, it's completely wrong. There are several thousand products that have been affected by the Department of Defense and CIA. It was just a couple of hundred, as far as anyone knew, back in the when we first began the research. But now that has been blown out of the water. We've got the lists from those organizations themselves: CIA, DOD, the White House as well, the FBI. They have absolutely caked the film scripts and TV scripts. And it's become an increasing problem over the last few years as well, since they've become more involved in reality TV shows to try and give a good impression for their soldiers when they go on cookery shows or quiz whatever, but also on larger projects about American military, such as Iron Man and Transformers and all these kind of things. An enormous amount of effort then goes into managing, let's say, democracy. You say it's overkill. It certainly looks like overkill. Where does it end? Well, it would end with nuclear war, unfortunately, which we really don't want to do. That's the logic of empire, because you end up, eventually you'll push a country too far, and that country could be something like Russia or China. You know, there's this common phrase around where people say, oh, it's a dangerous world out there. I think we should perhaps question that at a very fundamental level. Now, if you go looking for danger you'll find in the world, you're going to find it. But is it really fair to say it's a dangerous world out there? You've got Russia, which has got an economy the size of Italy. You've got China, which is a regionalist power. Those are the biggest nuclear-armed powers. You've got Iran, which is the enemies of our country are weak in comparison. But is this not part of the propaganda drive that you keep painting the baddie as the baddie? Yeah. And actually you keep sowing fear at home. Surely that's the age-old trick, which is the divide and conquer, but just on your own people. Is that not it?
Policy planners openly say we're looking for enemies. So in the case of Somalia, for example, one of the top Secret Service planners told Parliament that we're trying to look for links between like an Al-Qaeda group and Somali pirates. So we're trying to forge these kind of links so we have another excuse to get involved. Yeah. And you have the famous Project for the New American Century US neocon document talking about the need for a catastrophic event to justify, it wasn't just a few wars as people assume, it was a whole global control architecture of drones and backing out of missile treaties and so on. They openly say that we need enemies in order to continue justifying our policies.
Do these enemies realise that this is the oldest trick in the book?
I think, any government would know what the United States and Britain and the way that any other great power is conducting its play. That's just bound to be the case. They are part of that world. What those warring entities are relying on is that the people are not going to bother or have time to make themselves aware of how cynically and horrifically their masters are behaving. In fact, they want to give the impression that they are not their masters. Right. It's like that old quote, isn't it, from The Usual Suspects? The greatest trick that the devil ever pulled was making you believe that he doesn't exist. Yeah. That's the idea that we live in a democratic society, that our organizations that are running us are there just to help, rather than to actually operate power on the sly, which essentially is what your book has rather brilliantly shown, and some of your forerunners like Mark Curtis. And in your book, you identify many countries, which you reviewed the book. This is terrific.
So amazing evidence and very well documented. Just name some of the countries that Britain is involved in at the moment as a sort of sleeper cell, if you like, waiting, or as a destabilisation.
I thought this was so interesting about Tim's book, because I think we kind of get the impression that Britain is maybe involved in Iraq and Afghanistan. That's, if you watch Newsnight, that's kind of the typical. Tim's book shows really clear evidence showing we're involved in Sierra Leone, Kosovo, Iran, Colombia, Ukraine, Sri Lanka, Papua, Somalia, Bangladesh, Yemen, plus not to mention the fact that there's also several countries that we arm and this is more common knowledge, entities like Saudi Arabia. So I think although we don't want to overemphasize the ability of the British to control the world, I think it is fair to say that Britain is much more involved in many more countries than anyone kind of knows, on the street of Britain. And the potential for abuse there is really quite significant. We found that really interesting case. It was about a week ago. It was reported just at the end of Radio 4 News. I was just listening in the car. And it was reported that Britain was working with the Saudi government to repress rebels in Yemen. But at the same time, they used the phrase, or akin to the phrase, that there is no alliance going on with Saudi Arabia and Britain. So they were at the same time...
Operational alliance.
Operational alliance. They were denying that they were operating together in any meaningful way, because obviously the British people doesn't want Britain to be operating with the Saudi government, which it knows to be horrific.
What do we begin to do to hold power to account if the media is, corporate media or state media, is so incredibly toothless when it comes to these things?
If people en masse put in Freedom of Information Act requests, which people like myself and my regular co-author, Tom Secker do, it really does put the government under pressure to release important documents. I mean, the reason that we found that this list of several thousand films had been rewritten or worked on by the American state was just because we put in a Freedom of Information Act request. That's all we did. And the government is obliged to listen if more than one person puts in at the same time. So I'm not just talking about people putting in things for films, but anything to do with foreign policy. All it takes is a pro forma letter and then write it out, put it through email. Very rarely costs anything. Keep doing it. Do it with your friends. Get that information out. Stick it online. So that we are an informed population. That's a really important thing to do. But I think the other thing is just to recognise that these people lie like they breathe air.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your absolutely painstaking research. And you too, because unless we're having these conversations, we're not really talking about what's going on. That's it from Renegade Inc. HQ this week. You can drop the team a mail, studio@renegadeinc.com, or you can tweet us @Renegade Inc. Join us next week for more insight from those people who are thinking differently. But until then, stay curious.